Welcome to our webinar. Great to have you with us today. My name is Celine. In this webinar, I am delighted to introduce you to Omnis Studio. First, I will briefly tell you why I am using Omnis Studio and why I am so convinced by it. Next, we will provide an overview of the controls in the Omnis Studio development environment. Then we will move on to a practical example. And finally, there will be some additional information. Let's go. So, why Omnis Studio? Why do I use Omnis Studio and why am I so convinced by it? As soon as I started using Omnis Studio, I realized how quickly and easily I could develop apps without much prior knowledge. The first thing I realized with Omnis Studio is that it is very motivating and fun. And when using Omnis, I didn't have to install any other tools or packages to get started, which definitely made it easier. So you can get started straight away. And a major additional benefit is that the applications developed with Omnis Studio will run on all common platforms, so you don't have to adapt, customize, or recompile the code. This saves time and also money for me, plus it allows me to bring new releases and upgrades to the market quickly. But that's enough of the intro. Let's take a look at the Omnis Studio IDE. Here we can see 5 important windows for web development in Omnis Studio. To take them in order from the back, the Studio browser, the method editor, the design editor, and the component store. And on the right we can see the property manager. Let's start with the Studio browser. The Studio browser is the first window that you will see when the Omnis development environment opens. The Studio browser is the central window of the Omnis IDE. From here, you can access your projects or libraries and edit them using the other tools, such as the SQL browser. Next, the method editor is a tool to edit the methods of individual classes. In addition, the variables of a class and the associated task can be managed here. Then we have the design editor, where we can edit and design the components in a form. In the design editor, you can see an exact visual representation of the form, which makes the design process of the application much easier. Let's now look at the component store. This is the place for the individual objects or controls. From here, you can drag the components or objects you want directly onto the design editor and then edit them there. Plus, the component store shows all of the components available for the currently selected form. And finally, this is the property manager, which plays a very important role. Here, the properties of Omnis Studio, as well as the individual classes, objects, or components, can be adjusted. In addition to the windows just mentioned, there are several other important windows. However, I wanted to give you a brief overview in this webinar, so I won't go into too much detail right now. Now, let's move on to the practical exercise, in which we will create a simple example to show you how quickly and easily you can reach your goal. Then we will take a closer look at the component store, and we'll use some of the components. Afterwards, we will create a database connection, including a query using the SQL browser, and then have a look at the results. And finally, we will bring everything together in one nice form. The Hub provides information about Omnis Studio as well as application examples. The examples can be found under Samples. Here you can see how specific features can be implemented in Omnis Studio. It's also possible to reuse parts of the code in these sample apps in your own projects. Very helpful. We're going to create a simple example in the Omnis web client. Using the example app, you will be able to enter some text in an input field and then see this text as a message by pressing a button. To do this, we first go to Library in the Studio browser to create a new empty library, and now set any location and name, for example, Webinar. Now we can see a class and a folder. These are created automatically by Omnis Studio. In our case, we are creating a web application, so the Startup Task class is not important, and I won't explain the System Classes folder at this stage. A remote task is required for each web application. It instantiates the individual instances and encapsulates them for each user. In short, each time a user accesses a form, a remote task is opened as the basis for the form. Or in other words, it is not possible to open or access a form without a remote task. I always call it RT_start, which means remote task _ start. So now, let's create a form. To do this, click on New Class again, and then on Remote Form. In our example, I will call the form JS Input. Now, let's get to work on the form. To edit the form, I double-click on the class. We can see the design editor, as well as the property manager and the component store. Now, let's create the input option. For this, we need an edit control, which we drag from the component store, and we also need a button. I now give both objects an individual name so that we can easily address them later in the code. To do this, I select the object, in this case the edit control, and edit the property name in the property manager. I just call the input field edit and the button button. To output the text entered into the field, it must be stored somewhere. This can be achieved with an instance variable. An instance variable means that it is valid in the instance itself and only for as long as the instance is open. We could create the variable for the input field. That is where the input is temporarily stored via the method editor. But it is even simpler and faster to enter the desired name of the variable into the data name property of the edit control. We would have to enter the name of the variable in the data name property of the edit control anyway, so that it knows where to store the data. I will call the variable iInput. The I describes the scope, that is, instance, and input for input. No surprise. When I now leave the field or press Enter, Omnis tells us, stop, the variable does not yet exist. Shall I create it for you? Here I can still specify the type I want. However, in this case, character as type already fit perfectly. The next step is to name the button. So I select the button and go to the property Text in the Property Manager. There I can use whatever name I like, but I'll call it Output. Now we must edit the button so it outputs the variable. So we need to add some code. To quickly get to the code behind the button, double-click on the object in the design editor. Now we see the method editor. In the upper area, we can create or edit variables. We can see that our instance variable iInput is already there. Plus, Omnis has put on EV_click in the $event method of the button automatically. This means that the following code is executed when the button is pressed. That's exactly what we need, so let's go to the next line and enter do $CINST $show message open parenthesis close parenthesis. We pass iInput as a parameter in the brackets. Here, the do stands for something that must be performed, namely $CINST $show message. $CINST stands for the current instance, and this will execute $show message. $show message open parenthesis close parenthesis is similar to the JavaScript command alert open parenthesis close parenthesis. It outputs a push message with the content specified in the brackets, in our case iInput. Don't worry, it will not say iInput, but the contents of iInput. Let's test our work now. This can be done with a right-click in the design editor and then Test Form, or even easier, with Control or Command plus T, depending on your operating system. This also works within the method editor. So now I press Command plus T. My web browser opens, and straight away we can see our form. Let's try it out. I can enter something here and then press the button. Ta-da! Great, our first output. To show you a few more components, I have created a new remote form and named it JS Components. Now, let's take a look at the component store, but I can't show you all of the components in just this video. However, I think the label control is important. It is a text field for labeling something or for displaying a header. You can also use it for static text data that the user cannot interact with. Another interesting one is the data grid, which can display lists or tables of data, or the picture control to display pictures, and so on. So there are a lot for you to discover. Next in this example, I will drag another label and a rich text control into the form. I can either edit the text, property of the label, via the Property Manager, as we did with the button, or simply double-click on it to change it. I'll just enter the name of the form, JS Components. If we now test the form with Command+T, then we can see our label and the rich text control here. Let's now move on to the SQL browser. We can use it to create a database connection and to display some test data in a web form. To do this, we go to the SQL browser item in the Studio browser. First, we need to create the connection, so we click on the Session Manager and then New Session. In this case, I have some test data in the SQLite database that I want to access, so I will name the session SQLite. Then I select SQLite as the database. Now I need to enter the address of an SQL server under hostname, or I could create a new database file, but in this case I will select an existing file. Now I can test the connection. Great, everything works. I can click OK. So I've created the connection, or to be more precise, I have prepared it. Now we must open the connection. To do this, we go back and press Open Session and select the one we just created. If we go to Tables, we see our tables in the database, and we can look at each separate table. I will select the Data table and press Show Data in the menu. Now we can see the contents of the data table, which is really handy. Next, we're going to display the data from Data Table in a form. To do this, go to Query Builder in the menu. There you can easily compile SQL statements or create queries and convert them into a table class, and that's what we're going to do now. So I will select the table on the left, in this case Data, and check the columns I want to query. Then I'll press Run to see what results the database gives us, and everything looks fine. To convert the query into a table class so that we can output the results in a web form, I need to go to Other and then to Create Table Class. Now I can enter a name for the table class, plus I can also create a remote form, and that's exactly what we want. So check that option and give it a name, then press OK. Now let's have a look at the form. To do this, we go back to our library and test the new form, which I called JS SQL. To avoid having to go into an editor to test the form, we can right-click on the class and choose Test Form. That looks really great. And we can see the data grid control in action. That's very cool. Now it would be good to bring everything together into one form so that the user can switch between the forms. This might sound confusing, but trust me, it will be easier to understand after I've shown you. So I just need to create a new remote form and call it JS Main. Okay, let's get started. I need to go to the Design Editor. We need two items, a subform and a segment control, which will control the subform. And as you know already, we can get the components from the component store. The subform provides the option to integrate or switch to other forms. This is possible using the class name property or you can enter the name of the form that you want to display. However, I would like the objects to fill the entire screen or window, and this can be achieved with the help of so-called edge float properties. First, we select the segment control, then in the Property Manager, under the Appearance tab, go to Edge Float. Then we can select KEF Top Toolbar. This means that the segment control will sit at the top of the form and will adjust its own width to fit the form automatically. We can do a similar thing with the subform, except that we'll select Position Client as the edge float. This means that the subform will fill the entire space in the form apart from, in this case, the segment control that has the edge float property KEF Top Toolbar. Now I'll give the objects a name. I will call the subform Subform and the segment control simply Segment. The segment control will be used to switch between the forms we have created. It should therefore access the class name property of the subform. Now we have 3 forms that we want to display, and so far there are only 2 selection options or segments in the segment control. I also want to change the segment labels, but one thing at a time. To change the number of segments, I need to select the segment control and then change the segment count property to 3, which is on the Segment tab in the Property Manager. And while we're here, we can also change the labeling under segment text, but we need to pay attention to the property Current Segment, which shows which segment we're currently editing. Initially, the current segment is 1, so I can enter the label for the first segment. I want to be able to select the JS input form, so I will label it Input. Then, by setting the current segment property to 2, the values or properties of the second segment are shown. Here I can enter Components as the segment text, since this will display the JS Components form. Now I can go to the third segment and name it Data for the JS Data form. At this stage, we must write some code, so when a segment is selected, the subform will change accordingly. To do this, I need to double-click on the segment control. Now, I need to think about when the subform should display a different form. Well, in this case, it should change the form when a segment is clicked. So in the code editor, we need to enter on EV-click, just as we did with the button. But in this case, we had to add the code ourselves. Since there are more than 2 choices, we should use a switch case here. So we now write switch here, and the value to be queried is put straight after the word switch. In our case, onEvClick provides an event parameter called pClickedSegment. That is, after the user has clicked on a segment, this parameter will contain the number of the clicked segment. We need to add the case definitions containing all the possible segment numbers that the user can click on. In our case, 1, 2, or 3. Therefore, we type case 1, case 2, and case 3. Normally, there is also the case default, but we don't need it in this case because the user can only set the value by clicking on a segment, and there is nothing else in the form other than segments 1, 2, and 3. After case 1, we need to enter the code that changes the class name of the subform. This is done by referencing the property class name of the subform and then assigning a new value with $assign open parenthesis close parenthesis. To do this, we need to type do $cinst.objects.subform $classname $assign open parenthesis close parenthesis $cinst because we want to reference the current instance, then $objects subform to reference the subform object in the objects group, $classname and $assign to change the property $classname. But the value in the open parenthesis close parenthesis of the $assign function is missing, and for case 1, this is JS input. Now we can copy the line and paste it into each case. Then we need to adjust the values in the assign function accordingly. However, if we test the form now, the subform would only show a form when we click on a segment. Therefore, to define a kind of start form in the subform, we have to define the initial value of the class name property of the subform, so I will select the form JS input. That's it. Okay, let's test the form. Now we can change the forms by clicking a segment, but in reality, only the form in the subform changes. For example, here we have the JS Components form with the rich text editor. That's quite nice. I hope you gained a good first impression of Omnis Studio and its many benefits. For more information, please register for additional webinars or training courses. Both are a service to you by Omnis Software, and they are free of charge. I'm glad you made it this far and hope that you had as much fun as I did. See you next time.